who is going to facilitate our program today. Dr. Keaton, it's all yours.
Okay. We want to welcome everybody for joining us during this time. And we're calling this a teach-in. It's a virtual teach-in. And this is a moment for us to just collectively gather, pause, and take a moment or two to, reflect on, on the things that are necessary going forward. And, one of the things that I've been saying in my discussions, personally with friends and colleagues, is that I have not participated in any protests this year. Not because protests are not important, but I think our goal is to have something that is sustainable, right? We want this moment to turn into a movement. And to do that, there's going to need to be good teaching so that, the things that are important to us as a society, as we grow to a more perfect union, is to have some of these issues on the forefront of our consciousness as we go forward. And so now, while we have, sort of everybody's attention now in a new way, I think people were always, and people were already sensitive to some of the issues. But now I think people's heart and people's minds are open in a way that they haven't been before. So again, on behalf of the Greenspon Center, on behalf of Restorative Justice, we want to thank you for this time. We're calling this, it's been a long time coming. And so to start us off, we have Reverend Reggie Tuggle. He is, an esteemed pastor and been involved in civil rights issues probably longer than I've been alive, and he's been a good friend. And so we want to, again, thank you everybody for joining us, and I introduce you to Reverend Reggie Tuggle, Pastor Tuggle of Greer Heights Presbyterian Church.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm excited about what is happening worldwide, and I see there's a reaction to the George Floyd murder in 50 of our states. I don't remember ever seeing this kind of outpouring of interest and support for justice and for an end to police brutality in my entire life. I have only a few minutes. I need to get into what I want to say very quickly. I've been involved in civil rights activities since I was in high school. I remember driving in 1965 from Denver, Colorado to participate in a march in Atlanta, Georgia. Actually 1964. That was a very troubled year for civil rights. In that year, people were killed, they were lynched. It was a lot of unfortunate and terrible things. I want to begin with this message. When I was growing up, all of us had to say in every morning class, the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And this is what we said: I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, with liberty and justice for all. And then the other words we listed were, as part of our U.S. Constitution, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That became a mantra in the schools I grew up in Denver, Colorado. What I didn't know until much later in life as an adult, that people who made that pledge especially white people, didn't believe in the pledge at all. Because in both instances, we're making a pledge to the flag and to the republic which it stands, with one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all. And again, we talk about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The problem is with the word all, because when I hear the word all, when most of us hear the word all, we think it's inclusive. We think it means everyone. But that isn't what the framers of the Constitution had in mind. Many of the framers of the Constitution owned people as slaves. They were not regarded as part of the all when they talked about all men are created equal. The word all means inclusive, and yet somehow we've rooted ourselves in the thinking that this country was operating in that way. And so we have this false pretense that America is a country, because of our Constitution, devoted to justice for all, and that all of us are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So far, it's been a myth for many people who are Black and brown, because justice for all has not come down to mean us. My second point is this. I'm glad that restorative justice is getting off the ground here in Charlotte, and I'm so encouraged that we in Charlotte and Restorative Justice Initiative is finally getting beyond the rhetoric. All of us on this call, I imagine, have attended countless meetings over the years talking about race relations, talking about implicit racism, systemic racism, and other forms of racial bias. I must have attended, oh my goodness, dozens, maybe scores, maybe hundreds of meetings over the years in people's homes and in institutions. I've given lectures myself at various colleges, universities over the years. But so far, it has resulted in not much change. We are still dealing with the rhetorical response to a very physical, economic, social, and political injustice. Perhaps now this is the time to move beyond the rhetoric. And I want to thank Dr. Keaton, and I want to thank Judy, Rabbi Judy and Greenspan and others for helping to us get beyond the words. The words are comforting, but they don't mean much if we don't actually end up changing things. So I want to propose today the following things that we can do actively. One, we need to actively work to tear down barriers that deny adequate and decent housing for poor people. We talk about it a lot, but we don't really do an awful lot. But poor people are still poor, and they're still suffering, and often they are disenfranchised. So we, by definition, have to speak often in their behalf. Hopefully they'll join us. But they're still poor and they're still disenfranchised, and their children will probably have the same fate as their parents. We have to, number three, we have to support programs that promote racial justice and equality. As a city and as a state, we need to examine and look at where funding goes to support either profit or not-for-profit organizations that really work towards creating equity and equality. It makes, in my mind, little sense to dispense money or largesse in such a way that ignores the very viable social and political and economic injustice. We should be challenging ourselves to say, wait a minute, where is funding going? Is it going towards supporting those organizations that promote the status quo, or are we moving towards creating an opportunity for not-for-profits and others who are engaged in tearing down barriers and building up equity and equal opportunities for those who have been left behind. And we must be honest with ourselves. We cannot move forward unless we look out for those who have been left behind. This all business has little value if we give everybody the same amount of money. If I have $100 and my neighbor has $10, and I give each of you $25, that means the one has 100 now has $125. The one that had 10 now has $35. So the imbalance continues. We must move to eliminate the imbalance of privilege and opportunity. Number 4, we have to really examine how we treat people who've been released from incarceration. And we have, that's an unspoken about, very often ignored population. But we must support reentry projects. These individuals coming out with felonies or sometimes even misdemeanors, but certainly felonies, they're still in prison. They can't get a job very often. They can't get a loan for a car. They often can't get an apartment. They're denied a loan for a house, and all kinds of barriers that stand over against them. And the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated today in various federal and state institutions, prisons, when they come out, they will be denied, but not only that, their parents, their families will continue the experience that their loved ones are experiencing because they are tied together, because they're part of the same family. And if he or she, upon release from prison, cannot get adequate jobs or housing, then that entire community and that family continues to suffer. Number 5, we must support Black banks. We have to support Black banks because often those are the only banks that give us, and even they're a challenge sometimes, I know, but they're the only banks that help us move forward. So I'm urging that we support Black banks wherever we can. And I want to suggest further that we make it our business to educate ourselves and have uncomfortable conversations with our white brothers and sisters. Now, obviously, I'm not white, so I will not be part of your dinner discussions or part of your circles, your social circles. But where you are part of those circles, I want to encourage you to have uncomfortable conversations with those you love and those with whom you socialize, maybe go to synagogue or church with, and have those uncomfortable situations about privilege and about position and about political and social exclusion. You can say things to each other that those of us who are African American will never get a chance to say. Your voice should be heard in a different way, and I believe in a more profound way than any of us trying to express ourselves to your relatives and friends and social associates. But if Black lives matter, that discussion must be held among white people talking to other white people. That's where the rubber will hit the road. And that's when we'll begin to grow and to see a change in our society. I point us to a book that my wife and I read a couple of years ago, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's, in my mind, it's an imperative that everyone read this book because it shows all the ways in which racist policies and functionaries across the nation have aggressively worked for decades to keep Black people in inferior and segregated housing. The federal government, the state government, and city government have not hid the fact that they have put positions, policy positions, and practical positions that have actually denied, aggressively denied, opportunity for Blacks to own homes. And as you know, home ownership is one of the primary ways to build wealth, and that has been denied us. So I'm suggesting we do these things, and we do it aggressively, and without shame and without apology as we go forward. So that concludes my remarks. I know I have other speakers to speak as well, but I want to give them time to speak. But I want to say thank you for giving me an opportunity to share these words with all of us today.
Thank you, Pastor Tuggle, for your careful words that are clearly from your heart. Next, we have Reverend Ben Boswell, who is the esteemed pastor of Myers Park Baptist Church. Thank you, Pastor Boswell, for joining us at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Keaton. I'll speak today as a white pastor of affluent church in the wealthiest suburb in Charlotte, Myers Park, about the topic of decolonizing white wealth through the practices of redistribution and investment in the Black community. As Reverend Tuggle mentioned, we stand at a watershed moment in our nation's history when a multitude of Americans are fed up with the violent legacy of white supremacy and are demanding change. As you all know, many are demanding that Confederate monuments and flags be torn down or removed. Many are demanding that Confederate bases be renamed. Many are demanding that policing in America be transformed or defunded. Many are demanding new policies and legislation that will make America a more just and equitable society. But it's not just policing. I believe every institution and sector of American life has been infected with the disease. So if we want America to be a more just and equitable place, then everything has to change, from politics to education, law, banking, business, utilities, retail, food and agriculture, healthcare, nonprofit work, and the faith community. Every sector of American society has to be transformed. And when I speak about white supremacy, I want to be clear today, especially for white folks who are participating. I don't mean hatred, although white supremacy certainly includes hatred. I mean by white supremacy a culture of anti-Black violence that often comes in the form of economic oppression and injustice. Economic oppression and injustice being one form of violence. For instance, police brutality being another form of violence. Injustice being, as Coretta Scott King taught us, another form of violence. And so one of the sectors of American society that I think we need to talk about, and I will talk about this specifically from a white perspective, is the sector of philanthropy. We don't talk enough about philanthropy and why it also needs to change, especially white philanthropy. Some statistics: Charlotte regularly ranks in the top 10 of charitable cities in America. Fidelity Investments found that Charlotte ranks top 10 in giving to healthcare, 7 in giving to human services, and 5 in giving to religious causes. Top 5 cities in the nation in giving to religious causes. A 2018 study of the Charlotte metro region ranked us 6th overall in the nation in total charitable giving. And this particular study used tax returns to determine its Charlotteans on average gave 2.58% of their income to charity, and about 29.7% of all our tax returns in Charlotte reported some form of charitable donations. So the average contribution in Charlotte is about per year, a little over $6,000, which ranks in the top half of the study. So in summary, Charlotteans are incredibly generous people, incredibly generous, and have been for a long time. And yet, on the side of this statistic, we have to also put that we have ranked 50 out of 50 in economic mobility. How is it possible that we rank at the top in generosity and philanthropy and at the bottom in economic mobility? Something clearly isn't working. Why isn't all the charity and generosity working? I'm going to come back to this question at the end about wealth and why, to lead up to this, sort of why I imagine that we are struggling with this tension between being very, very generous and philanthropic, and yet it not making the impact in economic mobility that we needed to make. In a book that a lot of folks on this call have read, Decolonizing Wealth, the indigenous author and philanthropist Edgar Villanueva confronts the colonial dynamics that are at play in philanthropy and builds a framework that is centered around Black and indigenous and people of color and their communities. And Villanueva says that out of the $800 billion in assets that foundations, large foundations in America are sitting on, only 5% of that $800 million is being actually invested in grants. And then of that 5, only about 7 or 8% of that 5% has ever been invested in communities of color. The total amount of foundational wealth. And the trickle-down impact of those dynamics often result in very little investment or the moving of the needle on systemic issues, especially those supporting initiatives that are led by people of color. This sprinkling of dollars that is currently happening will never, ever repair the harm that's been done that Reverend Tuggle spoke to so clearly. So what Villanueva challenges us to do is to try to imagine something very difficult. How can philanthropy, he asks, play a role in the true restoration of wealth? In using resources and getting excited about investment in restoring what has been taken away versus the idea of hoarding and growing investment and endowment wealth. It's about equity, and that will require a shift in ownership. Another statistic Villanueva mentions is that in the United States, 7 of the richest grant-making foundations own roughly over $100 billion in assets. And many critics of these large philanthropic foundations point to the self-serving ways they benefit from their good charity through corporate lobbying, tax exemptions, and detracting from the harm that they often do in their own businesses to people of color and the environment. And Villanueva has a way of saying this in his book. He says that the basis of traditional philanthropy is to preserve wealth, and that wealth is fundamentally money that's already been stolen twice. Once through the exploitation of natural resources and cheap labor, and then a second time through tax evasion. So if you think about how people are, the environment is getting hurt, which of course hurts people, not just the environment, and then they're not paying taxes on it, so people are getting, again, the money's getting stolen twice. You probably heard Anand Giridharadas, who spoke this year at the CBI Stakeholders Breakfast, who makes the same claim in his book, Winners Take All. And he says that by refusing to risk its way of life, by rejecting the idea that the powerful might have to sacrifice for the common good, it clings to a set of social arrangements that allow it to monopolize progress and then give symbolic scraps to the forsaken, many of whom wouldn't need the scraps if society were working right. But Villanueva and Giridharadas say that there's a way to restore balance within this overwhelmingly white financial sector and to help social justice initiatives in the long term. Villanueva calls on people working in philanthropy to move away from the individualistic and transactional practices of rich people donating money to poor people, and instead calls us to adopt a culture of reciprocity, where their unity and building community is at the core of financing social change in our cities. So back to the question, why isn't all the generosity and charity and philanthropy in Charlotte working? Well, obviously we have a report from the Opportunity Task Force identifying the issue, and we have people now working to address key determinants and cross-cutting factors. But there was a report that I believe was overlooked and possibly even more significant for us at this moment now and for this question, that was done by Jean Nickel and Heather Hund from the North Carolina Poverty Research Fund. The report was entitled Economic Hardship and Racialized Concentrated Poverty and the Challenges of Low-Wage Work in Charlotte, North Carolina. What they found is that the biggest problem facing our city for economic mobility was concentrated racialized poverty right alongside concentrated racial wealth. Poor Black communities, extremely poor Black communities next to extremely rich white communities. And the conclusion of that study states that the paradox of wrenching poverty amidst plenty is Charlotte's most daunting challenge. It won't be overcome by ignoring it. Concentrated poverty implicates a complex suite of issues and policy determinations. But there's little doubt that efforts to achieve mobility and meaningful opportunity in Charlotte cannot be divorced from the burgeoning, racialized, and concentrating poverty that drives that marginalization's core. Practically speaking, mobility, inequity, segregation, and poverty cannot be effectively separated. They are the joined cousins of economic injustice. So, in summary then, it's pretty clear that wealth in Charlotte, as it is in many places across the country, but uniquely so here, is concentrated, organized. And so traditional philanthropy has not changed that fact and will not change that fact. It simply serves to preserve this dynamic. Therefore, we need a new philanthropic model that engages in the practice of decentralizing, redistributing, and reinvesting concentrated white wealth into Black communities. And this starts with a practice that this very organization, Restorative Justice, is dedicated to, which is restoring justice and restoring equity economically in our city. I think about, as a pastor, of course, I think about biblical models for us that call us to the practice of economic justice. One, of course, that I know my colleague, Rabbi Schindler, will appreciate is the concept of Jubilee, referenced in Leviticus 25 and then declared for us in Luke 4, where he himself says that his mission is to bring about Jubilee. But more practically instructive for me is the story of Zacchaeus in the Gospel of Luke, where, as you may know, Zacchaeus was defrauding people through the practice of tax collecting. And after Jesus comes to his house and has this moment, Zacchaeus realizes that he has been engaged in economic injustice and defrauding people, and he makes a declaration. He says, "Look, half my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." And then Jesus responds, "Today salvation has come to this house." So what I think people of faith need to do is to reconnect the biblical concept of salvation with the idea of restorative justice and economic equity. We need to ask ourselves, what if our salvation, liberation, our deliverance is determined by our ability to make restitution, to practice restorative justice and achieve economic equity? This is particularly important for white people of faith and good conscience to consider. I've been doing some work with white people to help them understand whiteness, to look at their white supremacy. And one of the things that white folks who have done the work of looking at whiteness often say is, if I was a Black person in America, I would want white people to do 2 things. 1, acknowledge what you and your ancestors did. And 2, give back what you stole from me. So both a reckoning and restitution are what's required. Reckoning without restitution is incomplete and insufficient. So what I personally, and I think on behalf of Myers Park Baptist Church and others who are working on this issue, restorative justice, we would like to call upon the largest philanthropic foundations in Charlotte to acknowledge the ways that white supremacy continues to impact their philanthropy, and to make a commitment to begin redirecting their investments into the Black community as an act of justice and equity. So for instance, the Foundation for the Carolinas, Bank of America Charitable Foundation, the Duke Endowment, J. Marion Sims Foundation, to acknowledge white supremacy and begin imagining how to redirect their investments into the Black community. Duke Energy Foundation, many others. We also call upon and invite the largest white and affluent religious communities in Charlotte to acknowledge the ways that white supremacy continues to impact their outreach efforts. and to make a commitment to begin directing their investments into the Black community in Charlotte as well. Our church, Myers Park Baptist, has committed a founding gift of $20,000 to Restorative Justice Charlotte. We believe that this is just the beginning of our own work as a congregation to look at the way that white supremacy still impacts our endowments and our outreach work as a congregation. And we would encourage our friends and neighbors in other communities of faith to join us and do the same. That concludes my remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Excellent, excellent. Pastor Boswell, I want to thank you for your honesty. A lot of what you said is a lot of what I've been hearing in private conversations where people are kind of afraid to really say those things out loud. And so I do want to thank you for your honesty and speaking from your heart. And what I like, you said, a reckoning without restitution is insufficient. And I thank you for that. Next up, we have Debbie Rabinovich. I always struggle with her name, but Debbie Rabinovich. Debbie is a brilliant young woman. She's just a brilliant person. And she's been with Restorative Justice from the beginning. And so she is going to have the next 15 minutes. And so we thank you, Debbie, for joining us.
Thank you, Willie, and thank you everyone for being here. It is really so good to be working on this. In Charlotte, I grew up here, and I mean, it's the title of today's teaching. It's been a long time coming, but what I want to get into in this little bit of time I have with you all is how long of a time it has been coming. And I want to talk a little bit, jumping off from where Reverend Boswell left off, like the idea of restitution, expanding it from the philanthropic realm into the idea of reparations. It's this word that many people are afraid to hear and afraid to say. And so I want to share a little bit about the history of reparations and talk about how work we're talking about is related to that. What do we mean when we say the word restitution? Do we mean reparations? And what do reparations even mean, right? To concretize this for everyone, I want to call back to something that probably happened for many of us a couple months ago. Maybe some of us are still waiting on it. I am, but some of us a few months ago received $1,200 in our bank accounts as a COVID stimulus, right? These weren't reparations, it was an economic stimulus. And the government expected us to live for 3 months on $1,200, which to many is laughable. And when I talk to my friends about it, when I talk to my colleagues about it, one thing that I've heard a lot is, yes, but more would be impossible, right? It is impossible for the government to endlessly supply money to sustain the public and or to create conditions of equity. And that is the same argument that's used often in arguments against reparations, that reparations are just impossible. How could we calculate 400 years of harm to the Black community? It's impossible for the government to ever pay back the debt that's owed. That idea of impossibility is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we say something is impossible, the less possible it becomes. And that loop is the biggest barrier. So I think it's really important for the actually long history of reparations in this country, which is a history almost as long as the history of oppression in this country. I'm going to start by sharing the story of Belinda Royal with you all. Some of you may know this story, some of you may not, but I think that naming it is really important, and knowing that it happened is very important. So Belinda Royal was born in 1713 in Ghana, and she was moved by the royal family in Massachusetts. The royal family was instrumental to founding and funding Harvard Law. So their wealth is tied to the understanding of law in this country and to the formation of institutionalized power in this country. And Belinda Royal was a Ghanaian woman who was enslaved by this family. the royal family ended up fleeing to Nova Scotia, so they didn't actually stay in the United States. And when they did, in 1783, Belinda Royal presented a petition to the Massachusetts General Court requesting a pension from the royal estate, which is what funded Harvard Law School. And she was awarded 15 pounds and 12 shillings as the reparations for her labor. And this is almost nothing. 15 pounds and 12 shillings is not even a currency we use here, but it was nominal compared to the labor that she did and the way that her exploited through the system of slavery. But nevertheless, it established this legal precedent. In 1783, reparations into recognizing the labor she had done. So when people say reparations have never happened or reparations are impossible, they're wrong and they don't know this history. But 15 pounds and 12 shillings seems like nothing, right? And we hope something that's much more expansive. If 15 pounds and 12 shillings is on one end of the spectrum, another example for all of you that happens 200 years later. One thing that we don't talk enough about in our history classes is about the internment of Japanese Americans in America during World War II. And I think that in my experience in the history classes I took here in Charlotte, it was barely touched upon, the fact that Japanese Americans were rounded up and interned. And the conversation resurfaced a bit the most recent years with migrant internment and migrant detention. But overall, the issue of Japanese internment is not discussed. And it seems unrelated from this issue of reparations, and especially it seems like it's kind of a tangent from what we're talking about today, which is reparations and restitution and redressing the injustice done to the Black community. But this is why solidarity is so important, because internment ended, the Japanese American community campaigned for decades. And in 1988, the US Civil Liberties Act was passed. The language in this act is powerful. The legislation states that the government actions had been based on, and I quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. That's in an act passed by Congress and ratified by the Senate, which giving each surviving internee $20,000 in compensation. That's $40,000 in today's money. So it was given to over 80,000 interns. So when we talk about reparations being impossible and more than $1,200 being impossible, it's also not true. There is precedent and history for far more being accomplished, and it dates back to the founding of the country. And some of it happened within our lifetimes. I mean, not my lifetimes, but most of the people on this call, during your lifetimes, reparations were given. And most people are woefully unaware that this happened because this conversation is not promoted or discussed. And why? It's because the idea of reparations and the idea of restitution realizes our notion of what's possible. Muhammad Ali said that impossible is not a declaration, it's a dare. It's a prove impossible wrong, right? We have to dream bigger, and until we do, it is indeed impossible. You know, reparations can't happen, and changing the way that philanthropy works and decolonizing wealth can't happen if we continue to believe these things are impossible. So I really hope that these two examples on opposite kind of ends of our history can serve to show the magnitude of things that can be accomplished through reparations and the things that have already been accomplished, and to really encourage you all to open your minds every time you hear something's impossible or something could never happen. Challenge that thinking. And the reason why is because of what we're talking about right now is about burnout. People feel tired, especially the Black community. And I think that the only way past that is through hope. And the only way to have that is really by understanding what is possible, you know? I hope this is helpful. I think I talked really fast and I went through two examples really quickly, but I think that there is a whole body of work on the issue of reparations. This is what I'm studying in my master's program. Ta-Nehisi Coates has done great work on it. We can't just be reading, but is the foundation, theory. And I think it's really important to increase our worldview and to broaden the perspective of what's possible. So I hope this was helpful, and I appreciate you all hearing it out. Willie, you're muted.
There we go. Again, I just want to say, Debbie, thank you again for all of your hard work. And, the next teach-in session we have, we'll work a little bit harder to make sure that there's more inclusion. We invited a lot of different people, and some people couldn't get back to us. So just know that we do recognize that this is, that this is not reflective of the justice community, and we do need more, powerful women at the table to express their views on these issues. So thank you, Debbie. And next up, we have Professor Dr. Rodney Sadler. He really doesn't need an introduction, but Rodney, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for all that you're doing in the community. And the next 15 minutes are yours. Thank you, brother.
Thank you so much, Willie, for this opportunity to be here. Thank you, Judy, for the invitation to come in. I know that we have all been working together on some of this work for a long time, and it's great to see that this, your center is taking off in this new way, responding to crisis in this community. And thank you for continuing to pioneer this truth and reconciliation model. It is a timely model, as we can see as we look at our world today. One of the things that stands out to me, we started this conversation off with Reggie Tuggle bringing up the words, all means all. What if we actually were able to achieve that at some point? What if we hold these truths to be self-evident that all human beings were created equal was actually a mantra that meant something in the United States of America? I've always held that it did. I've always stuck to the belief that it did. I last week hung an American flag on my back porch. Seems an odd thing to do in the middle of an uprising, to hang an American flag again, but I decided to do it because I wanted to remind myself that I really do believe in what the ideal of America stands for. I really do believe in that exceptional notion that all human beings are created equal. Just that we never have come close to that in reality, in actualizing that vision. So that flag hangs on my back porch now as a reminder to me each time I see it, that I've got a lot of work to do if we are to ever achieve this great idea. This idea has become more elusive in the last several weeks as we've looked at the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, who is the galvanizing force that seems to be bringing America, no, not just America, the world together to deal with this issue. My sister in England talks about the protests they've had there. My brother in Bermuda talks about the work that they're doing in Bermuda. Around the world, there's places like Syria and Palestine. This issue is being brought up. This is not a simple issue, but it's fostering significant change around the world. But my concern at this moment when we see these uprisings taking place is that this is not the first time it happened, and it might be more significant now because it took place when people have more time to themselves because of Corona quarantine and are able to pay attention to it in a new way. It was a horrible image that we saw of the death of George Floyd on screen. Maybe it's motivated us. But then again, I thought the exact same thing when Keith Lamont Scott was killed. And I thought the exact same thing when Danquarius Franklin was killed. And of course, I really thought the exact same thing when, before all of that, Jonathan Ferrell was killed. Jonathan Ferrell, a man who did literally nothing wrong except run to the police to help save his life after a car accident, was gunned down. I'm sure that justice would have been done in that instance. I was sure that change might come. The unfortunate thing is when these situations happen, we tend to get motivated to get behind movements for a moment, and those movements tend to trail off. We tend to raise issues that are specific to a point in time. We need to put police officers need to have cameras on them so we can see what they do, and that way they'll behave better. Or police don't need to have tear gas in their arsenal to use against civilians. Or police need to make sure that they've got de-escalation training. And we keep making incremental changes and arguing for incremental changes, and we end up in the exact same situation once this is done. Worse than that, we also realize that if we focus even on police reform, we leave out education. And we focus on education, we leave out housing. We focus on housing, we leave out employment. We focus on single issues, incremental change, and we end up in the same situation where we are. I have a plant that I planted long ago near my mailbox. It was a rose bush. I always wanted roses around my mailbox. I thought it'd be beautiful. Then as the rose bush grew, it became unwieldy. It became a bit gangly, and it had thorns on it, and it started to prick the mail people, the mail carriers when they were delivering things. So I had to cut it down. Strange thing about this plant is every time I cut it down, it comes back. Every time I cut down this rose bush, it comes back, and I try to fix up new things there around it. The rose bush keeps coming back. In part, I think the rose bush keeps coming back because I cut down the top, but I never get to the root. As we wrestle with this issue in America, I think that far too often we're cutting down the rose bush, but we're not getting to the root. We deal with instances of racism. We deal with instances of racial oppression. We deal with instances of personal prejudice. We even will talk about systemic racism. But we never deal with what I think is the heart of the concern. And this is the idea of race itself. The idea of race itself, the idea that we are fundamentally different as human beings, that we are endowed with differences that manifest in character, that manifest in behavioral traits, that not only manifest in these ways, but entitle us to different wealth, power, and privilege in society. This is fundamentally something that I think needs to be excised from the American mind like a cancer that it is, that continues to come back. We've got to find a way, once and for all, not just to deal with instances of racism, but to root out the ideological cause that undergirds it all, that which keeps it coming back. We get rid of slavery, we keep race, we get Jim Crow. We get rid of Jim Crow, we keep race, we get mass incarceration and the war on drugs. We get rid of, we start to work against mass incarceration, war on drugs, we keep that, we get MAGA, Making America Great Again. We continue to get rid of racist expressions, but we never root out the heart of the problem. So my proposition today is that we need to find a new way forward, a new way that recognizes that we are all fundamentally the same on the inside, that we all should be guaranteed the same rights on the outside, that society should reflect a greater notion of equality at its core, that we need to look at what's going on. I think perhaps a different way of saying it is this. We often will look at the machine that is America and we'll try to repair pieces of it where we think the pieces are broken. We try to repair a piece here, a cog there, a nut and a bolt there, and try to remake this machine slightly. But we need to realize that the machine really isn't broken. The machine is working the way the machine was supposed to work. And it's time for us to fundamentally remake the machine. We've got to tear down the old machine and remake a new machine. We have to reimagine America, as it were. And that's where I think we are right now. So if you're asking me what I think we need a 50-plus state solution. We need to have truth and reconciliation commissions that run the extent of this nation, that begin to dig down deep on the various issues that exist, and begin to provide a new way forward that reconstructs America. At the end of the day, I'm really going to argue that we need a second constitutional Congress to remake everything about this nation from the heart all the way up. We need to be able to say that as Americans, we want to live up to those ideals that we say are at our heart. I propose a two-part track going forward, and please forgive the phone in the background. There's nothing I can do about it now. I propose a two-part track as we go forward. One is a hearings track that begins to listen to the stories of people to bring out the heart of this issue, help people across the country to see what race has done to people historically and what it continues to do to people today. So we can begin to find a way to sensitize us to what's going on. Then at the same time that that track is working and uncovering stories and issues that people are still dealing with, we need a redress track, a track that will come up with solutions to problems that exist, that will find a new way forward for us to wrestle with these issues, that will mine the solutions that have already been put on the table for so many years and find out if there are ways of dealing with housing and education and employment and opportunity, and utilize those and not just sit them on shelves. It always amazes me that we've had a 10-year plan to end homelessness in Charlotte that sat on a shelf for 10 years. It's time for us to take a new posture, to take a new tact. It's time for us to reimagine what it is that we are as American people. It's time to recognize one essential truth, that we have the power to change the system. I said this before the other day, and this is going to be my mantra now until the day I die. My greatest fear is on that day that I die, I get to see Jesus face to face on that great getting up morning. I go to him and I say, Jesus, why were there African-American people suffering across this country? Why were there indigenous American people suffering across this country? Why was it that you did nothing more to help them, to lift them out of their poverty, to lift them out of the inequality in which they lived, to provide a greater opportunity for all people? Why is it that you did nothing for it? My greatest fear is that Jesus is going to look at me and say, Rodney, why didn't you? We have the power to change the system. We just need the collective will to do so. And my charge to us all today is that we begin not to just look at the shoots, the thorny bushes of that rose bush, but that we begin to finally address the root, that which is race and how it has undermined the potential of America to truly be exceptional. God bless you all.
God bless you. That was truly wonderful. So much there to unpack. I'm glad we're recording all of this. The closing thought that I have, and then Rabbi Judy is going to have some remarks. The closing thought that I want to share with you is only going to be about 10 minutes, if maybe less. The closing thought I have is this: equal contribution should mean equal distribution. Equal contribution should mean equal distribution. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the history of Charlotte, it is clear that African Americans have had an equal contribution in building this country and building Charlotte and other cities. I was recently given a book. It's called The Bittersweet Legacy. It's a very powerful book. And in it, it talks about George Washington's first visit to this area of Mecklenburg and what is now Charlotte. And when he was here, after leaving, he said that this area was a trifling place because it was in its infancy in terms of development. And so when you think about that, from that moment to the moment of Reconstruction, Charlotte had a very large population of slaves. There was a lot of slave labor in Charlotte. When you think about the cotton industry and the cotton mills that were here, Charlotte, the early wealth that Charlotte began to develop and began to build its city, it came from the cotton fields, and it came from, a large percentage of it came from the work that was done in the cotton fields, and the industry of the textiles. That's a fact. And as the city began to grow and it needed a railroad to help further, the development, it was the slave labor that helped to build those railroads, to make Charlotte this industrial city, so that it could have its progress that we are so proud of, and many people are so proud of. So equal contribution means equal distribution of wealth. But what we've seen now is that even though the slaves played a major role, and at one point, the population of Charlotte was 40% slaves. So even though this city was built on the backs of slaves, and even though the land itself was Native American, remember, Trade and Tryon was two ancient trading posts from Native Americans. So when you think about it, you realize that the land was Native Americans, and then the land itself was worked by African Americans who were made and forced to be slaves. So stolen land, stolen labor, equal contribution. In the wars, African Americans fought in the wars that helped us to realize the freedom that we all talk about. So there's been equal contribution, but there hasn't been an equal distribution of wealth. And so Charlotte is this great city because of our contribution. But then think of the immoral ways in which the wealth then began to be centralized, and also the poverty centralized among the Blacks who helped build it. There was immoral practices of redlining. There were immoral practices of restricted deeds. There were immoral practices of urban renewal, which we heard and was talked about. There was this practice of building highways through the communities of African Americans. So African Americans in this country, we have this history of taking nothing and making something out of it. And so whatever land that wasn't wanted, African Americans took it and built communities on it. And then later, policies in Charlotte began to tear those very same communities down. Think about Brooklyn. Brooklyn was a land, and Second Ward was a land that they didn't want. The powers of Charlotte did not want it. It was a floodland. And so, again, our history is taking nothing and making something out of it. So what did African Americans make out of that floodlands? We built a Black Wall Street. So when urban renewal came and they decided in a contested city council meeting in 1960 to destroy Brooklyn, which they called a slum, which all of it wasn't a slum, but again, the powers that be controlled the narrative. So we're talking 1,400 homes. We're talking 216 businesses. We're talking pharmacies, lawyers, 12 churches, 2 schools, a library, a college that became Johnson C. Smith. So we were building a community. We were building our own legacy. But again, it appears just not in Charlotte, but in other places in this country, African Americans, we always receive the short end of the stick. And so now what you have, and I'm so proud that Pastor Boswell touched on it, because I wanted to touch on it, but I was anxious, but I was going to do it anyway. You now have 2 cities. 2 cities. You have a city of prosperity and you have a city of poverty. But the reality is those who make up the city of poverty help build this city. You have the second largest banking center in the United States. You have the #1 philanthropic institution in all of North Carolina, all in Charlotte. But right in the shadows of all that wealth is a tent city. There's a whole area that we're calling the Crescent that is filled with Black poverty. And so you have two cities, one prosperity, one poverty. You have two school systems. You have one school system that has a plethora of boosters and it's performing well, but then you have another school system that is predominantly African American, it's underfunded, and it's underperforming. And I think we can make a strong argument that if it not had been for the immoral practices of white supremacy in Charlotte, that African Americans would be able to fend for themselves. But now we're not. Now we have to go to the philanthropic agencies and receive crumbs off of their tables. We have two criminal justice systems. That's why the county jail is predominantly African American and people of color. We have two religious communities. We have what Dr. King would call white moderates and white churches with wealth and endowment, and you have Black churches who struggle to pay their pastors. We have homeless shelters that are full of African Americans, a foster care, predominantly African Americans, children and their families, African Americans living in poverty. And so, like Pastor Boswell mentioned, this upward mobility that we all talk about, how Charlotte is 50th out of 50th. And, you know, the 800-pound elephant in the room is that it's the African American economy that is bringing down the whole economy. And so that is why Charlotte is 50th out of 50th, is not because of the white economy, it is because of the Black economy. So we've gone from the cotton fields until now in 2020, a lot of African Americans are still not even making $8 an hour. And a lot of that has to change. COVID-19 exposed this disparity that many of us already knew was there. And so we can't even help our own communities because the wealth has been centralized in other areas. And so we don't have the luxury to continue to teach without action. We need to teach, but there has to be action. This is a moment now where change is before us, but we want to take this moment and make it a movement, but we need teaching and we also need action. Dr. Sadler talked about that rose bush, and I have a very similar metaphor. And I say, we need to stop raking the leaves and go towards the branches and the root of the problem. Every time we give a nonprofit pennies on a dollar to make a difference, that's just raking up leaves. But we have to now go to the branches, to the root of the problem, and the root of the problem is the racist ideas and the racist ideologies that have permeated our society and makes people feel as though Blacks should not have the same opportunity as whites. But I say that's a fallacy. There's equal contribution, so there should be an equal distribution of wealth. Now, I did notice we have Brother Joe Seigel and I think he's still here. Is he still here or did he leave?
I'm here.
Joe, you still on?
Yes, Reverend.
Yes. Close us out. Give us 5 minutes, and then Rabbi Judy is going to close us out with comments. But I didn't want to let this moment go by without you taking a few moments. And then tonight at 6 o'clock is our other meeting, and Joel is going to be there as well. But take about 5 minutes and just talk to us, and then Rabbi Judy is going to have some closing remarks.
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be in the company of such incredible intellectuals and love warriors. And I think Rabbi Judy Schindler has to be congratulated for this incredible work that she's done. I've been fundraising for 36 years, and it's so hard to raise money, especially for this kind of issue, racial equality, and then you, Reverend, for the work that you're doing. I guess all I can say is I think we're in a Kairos moment that I've never seen in my lifetime. I've been working on social justice for 36 years. And the death of George Floyd and COVID-19 is unfortunately a perfect storm for a revolution of values where we become, as the Buddhists say, more heart-centered. And I think that if this coalition that the center has put together, that you all have put together, can just remain intact, no matter how long it takes, and build what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. The beloved community is so important because unless there's a beloved community among those who are trying to make the societal change, such as systemic racism, you can't really go that far, because most people will agree on the policies that we find to be morally corrupt and evil, but they don't have the kind of beloved community between the actual leaders to make that change. I feel a beloved community right here on this beautiful town hall. I will just add that decolonizing wealth is just so important. I echo and agree with everything that has been said on this call. I would say, why can't Charlotte, instead of being 50 out of 50 in upper mobility, why can't it be number one? Can we reimagine Charlotte as a city in the country that becomes number one in getting out of mobility? Can we imagine a city where there is housing for all, where there are jobs for all who want to work, where there is childcare for all who need it, where there are schools that are all equal and they look like private schools, where there's a maximum wage instead of a minimum wage, where there is no more permanent Black middle class. And I think that's something that we've cooperated with, this idea of a Black permanent underclass instead of a permanent Black upper and middle class, which would resemble what I think Europe is. And I hope that what we can do is, when we listen to the voices of the people who often don't get heard by task forces — I've worked in government my whole career — that we really listen to the people who are oppressed, who don't get heard, and when they tell us what policies that they would like to see implemented, that we then translate that into lobbying and education so we can actually see measurable results. And I'll close by saying, when Rodney said there's been a plan on the books for 10 years, to end homelessness, I think there's 34,000 people on the waiting list for the public housing. I used to run Charlotte's emergency shelter system. And would it be that hard as something that we could all do, is just come up with a plan to end it and then lobby for it, get money from the state government, the federal government, foundations, and get this done? I do think there's one thing I did not hear, though, in this conversation that I would like for perhaps to be some more discussion on. What's the role of local, state, and federal government in funding reparations and restitution of the Black community? Ronald Reagan and the Bushes, their 1,000 points of light, I call it the 1,000 points of darkness, has resulted in actually worse outcomes for upward mobility. You could tax beer a nickel a quart. You could do bond referendums. We can get money from Alma Adams the state legislature of North Carolina has a $3 billion reserve fund. So that's all I want to say. You have to have federal government and local and state government if we're going to solve these intractable problems, because foundations just don't have enough money to do that. But thank God for them. But I'm just honored that I was given a chance to speak, and all these brilliant people on this town hall. I feel like there's something special here, and I'd like to be a part of anything where I can help the community and my Black family. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joel, for those inspiring words. Thank you all for those inspiring words. Thank you to the Stan Greenspan team and Stan Greenspan and Debbie and Donna. And most of all, thank you, Dr. Keaton, for pushing me each and every day to take this journey as your supporter and friend. In 2016, 2015, we had the trial of Officer Carrick, who killed Jonathan Farrell. And a call went out to ask if any clergy would be a part of her support team. Mrs. Farrell, the mother of Jonathan, as she went through the trial, and I raised my hand, and sorry, I'm just muting someone who's unmuted. So I raised my hand, and I offered to be a part of that trial. To be with her during that trial. And on the first day, Brenda, would you mind muting? Oh, I got it, okay. On the first day of the trial, I offered to take Mrs. Farrell out to lunch, and I get to the courthouse, and they're putting not Officer Carrick on trial, but Jonathan and his character. He'd been in a car accident. He went to seek help. The woman in the home called the police. She was nervous, she had a child. The police arrived. And reacting with excessive force, Officer Carrick shot Jonathan 12 times, even after he was down. And they put Jonathan's character on trial, and the courtroom broke for lunch, and I went up and said, Mrs. Farrell, I'm Rabbi Judy, and she introduced me to her whole family around her. I said, Mrs. Farrell, why don't I come back another day and take you out to lunch? You have so much family here right now. And she said to me, Rabbi Judy, you are family. And so we have to see all of us as family standing together. We are family. I had this insight on this call, you know, in the worst pandemic, this worst time in global history that so many of us have seen in our lifetime, this physical virus is helping us to better see an economic, spiritual, moral violence that is killing our country and killing each one of us. And so we are on a process of healing, not only of healing from the pandemic, but we are healing from 400 years of violence against our Black brothers and sisters. And healing is a three-part process in Judaism. Number one, an apology. We did wrong. Number two, restorative justice. We are creating a restorative justice fund for everyone to fund so the Black community can give money to the Black community and not be held in a system of double theft of money and the distribution of trickles making it through. So if you say amen today, please go to Restorative Justice Charlotte, say amen, and give money to right and historic wrong. It can be a Bernie Sanders style campaign with grassroots and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of citizens saying, I get it, we did wrong. Money can be used to hurt and money can be used to heal, and we need to use our money to repair the wrongdoing. Step number three is changing systems so we don't replicate it over and over again. So as you give to this Restorative Justice Fund, when it's set up, we're working on that. We have a fund startup, but we will set up an endowment. You can say, I want it to go to criminal justice because we built a courthouse and a jail where a Black community once thrived. I want it to go to the faith community, to mental health because we caused trauma, to business and entrepreneurial loans, to education and scholarships and pre-K. You can determine where you want that money to be spent, and the African American community will allocate it differently than the white philanthropists have done all this time. We will set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because we need truth-telling, we need justice before there can be reconciliation. And we have set up Restorative Justice Charlotte. Where is its office? At Mecklenburg Investment Corporation, the center of Black Wall Street in Charlotte. We will be there tonight on the steps of Grace AME Zion Church at 6 o'clock. Bring your lawn chair, bring your soda, your iced tea, bring your heart, bring your passion, bring your commitment, and invite others to join us to right this historic wrong. Lola Watson said, if you've come to me, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because my redemption is tied up with yours, then let us work together. As Pastor Boswell said, our redemption is tied up with the redemption of our Black and brown brothers and sisters. So healing will come to this global pandemic, this worst crisis we've seen in our lifetime. And at the same time, we will work tirelessly for healing to come for this pandemic of racism that has lasted centuries. I have hope, I have faith, and most of all, I have all of you to walk side beside me and to stand behind the Black leadership of this community to make it happen. So thank you for coming. We'll see some of you tonight. We'll see some of you on this journey to restorative justice. Amen.